He said, "I've been waiting, and everything I came in there to prove just fell out of me like I'd been emptied. I had walked through that door with one purpose, to end the argument, to look around, confirm there was nothing, and make the call that would finally move my project forward. I was a prince. I had engineers and attorneys and permits and a timeline. I did not lose arguments with empty buildings, but I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, and I could not explain, not then, not in any language I had ever been taught, what I was looking at. If you want to know what I found inside that church and why I never touched it again, stay with me. Subscribe so you're here when the next story drops, because this one is only the beginning. I need to take you back, not to explain myself, not to make excuses, but because you can't understand what happened inside that building without understanding who I was before I walked through that door. My name is Nasser bin Rashid, and I grew up in a world where the answer to almost every question was, "You will understand when it is your time." I was there for a real estate conference. One of those events where the rooms smell like leather and cold air, and the conversations are always about numbers that have so many zeros, you stop thinking of them as money and start thinking of them as score. I was the youngest person in most of the rooms I entered that week. I knew it. I used it. Being underestimated by men who wear their wealth like armor is one of the great advantages of the world, if you know how to work inside it. There was a developer there, Swiss, older, a man who had built half of a certain skyline in Central Europe and who moved through that conference like he owned the air in it. Everyone wanted his attention. I watched people angle toward him all week the way flowers angle toward a window. I didn't angle. I waited. On the last evening there was a dinner, long table, maybe 30 people, and I ended up seated 2 chairs down from him. I did not maneuver for it. It just happened. And midway through the meal he looked across the table at me and said, in English, "You've been watching me all week." I said, "I've been learning." He studied me for a moment. Then he said, "What did you learn?" I said, "That the people who want your attention the most are the ones you'll never remember." He laughed, a real one, surprised. We talked for 2 hours after that dinner. He told me something that night that I carried with me for years like a compass. He said, "The mistake young developers make is building for the city. You have to build for the photograph. The photograph is what survives. The photograph is what travels. Build something that looks powerful in a photograph and you'll never have to explain yourself again." I wrote that down in the notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. I wrote it down and I believed it completely. Build for the photograph. That sentence shaped the next decade of my career. Every project I touched, I held it up against that idea. Would this look powerful from above, from a distance? In the kind of image that gets shared and studied and used as a reference point by other developers in other countries? I became very good at building things that photographed well, and I became, without fully realizing it, a man who evaluated almost everything by how it would appear from the outside looking in. That is who I was when I acquired the Al Rawda land. That is who drove to that church on a Thursday morning. The call to prayer was still part of my mornings. Fajr before the light fully came up, the familiar Arabic moving through the quiet of the house, the cool of the floor under my feet when I rose. It was the oldest rhythm I knew. It had never not been there. But I want to be honest with you. I was not a man who dwelled in his prayers. I moved through them the way you move through a morning routine. Present enough, faithful enough, but my mind was usually already at the day ahead, already at the site, already at the numbers. I prayed, and then I built. I prayed and then I planned. The two things existed in separate rooms inside me, and I had never thought to open the door between them. That is the man I was. Disciplined, focused, genuinely not cruel, I want to say that. I was not trying to harm anyone. I was trying to build something that lasted. I just had the completely wrong idea of what lasting meant. The Al Rawda development was the project that was going to define me. There were quiet conversations happening in my family about who would step into my father's regional governance role when he stepped back. Nothing loud, nothing declared, just the kind of talk that lives in the spaces between official conversations, in the pauses and the looks, and the way certain men in certain rooms suddenly start paying attention to you differently. I understood what was happening, and I understood that the next move I made mattered. Al Rawda was going to be that move, a luxury coastal resort, world class. The kind of project that gets written about internationally. The kind of thing that made a name travel further than any title could carry it. I had investors, I had architects, I had a timeline that was aggressive but achievable. What I had not planned for was a church. The land stretched across what used to be a mixed residential area. Most of it had already been cleared through proper legal channels, fair settlements. more than fair. I was not interested in taking from people without giving something back. That mattered to me. But one building remained, a small stone church at the edge of the parcel, old, not legally protected. The congregation had reportedly dwindled years ago. My legal team confirmed no active services, no registered pastor, no recent activity of any kind. By every document I could produce, the building was empty. I made an offer, more than the land was worth, enough to build something newer, something better, somewhere with a real community around it. No response. Second offer, higher, still nothing. I was not worried. Resistance was part of the process. The math always caught up eventually, so I moved forward. Permits, equipment, crew. I stood on the edge of that property one morning watching the light come off the coast, and I thought about what this place was going to become, what I was going to become because of it. Everything was in order. And then it wasn't. The first bulldozer stalled 20 feet from the church. Mechanical issue, I assumed. Equipment fails. The rental company sent a technician. The machine ran perfectly everywhere else on the property. The moment the operator moved it toward the church, it stopped. They brought a second machine. Same thing. I told my project manager, a man named Samir, to document it and work around it for now. We had other sections of the site to clear. We would come back. 2 days later, Samir called me. The survey equipment is doing something strange near the church. I asked him what he meant by strange. GPS readings are off. Every device we use within 30 feet of the building puts us somewhere we're not. We recalibrated 4 times. Same result every time. I drove out myself with a handheld unit, walked toward the building slowly. At a certain distance, the screen showed me standing in a location that was clearly not where my feet were. I stepped back. Normal reading. Stepped forward. Wrong location again. I stood there for a long time. I am not a man who reaches for supernatural explanations. I was educated in the UK. I understand how equipment works and how it fails and the difference between an anomaly and a pattern. I was looking, at this point, at a pattern, but I was not ready to name what kind of pattern it was. Then the workers started leaving. Not dramatically, quietly, one at a time and then in small groups. The foreman called me one evening and said 3 men had refused to return to the site. When I pressed him for a reason, he said the men reported hearing something near the church. Not a sound they could describe, just something that made them unwilling to be close to it. During working hours? I said. Yes, sir, he said. During the day. Within 2 weeks, I could not find a crew willing to touch that specific structure. Word had traveled the way it travels on job sites, quietly and completely. I called 3 different subcontractors. All 3 declined. I remember sitting in my car one evening outside the property, engine off, just looking at the building. The glass in the arched window over the door was intact. I had expected it to be broken. The door was in better condition than it had any right to be given how long it had supposedly been empty. The iron cross on the roof was old and slightly rusted but standing straight. It looked like somewhere someone still came to. I couldn't explain that. Samir came to me and suggested a delay. He was careful about it. He laid out the business case, the PR considerations, the risk of pushing forward when the labor situation was this complicated. At the end of all of it, he said, "Sometimes the smart move is to wait." I looked at him across the desk. "I've been waiting," I said. "I need this to move." He nodded and didn't push it, but I could see what was in his eyes. He wasn't worried about the project. He was worried about me. I called a friend that night, Faris. We had gone to university together in London. He was now a civil engineer with a firm in Dubai, and he was the kind of person I could say the strange things to without them being held against me later. I told him everything. The equipment, the GPS, the workers. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "So what's your next move?" "I'm going to go in myself," I said. Pause. "Okay," he said. "Call me after." I knew he didn't think anything unusual was happening. I wasn't entirely sure I did either. But I also knew that I had spent my adult life walking toward things instead of away from them. I was not going to let an empty building be the exception. Thursday morning, clear sky, wind off the coast carrying salt. I told Samir to wait outside. No cameras, no one else. This was not a moment I wanted witnessed. I needed to walk in and walk out and make the call I had been trying to make for weeks. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The quiet in there was not the quiet of an empty building. I have been in empty buildings. They have a hollowness to them, a sound of nothing, an absence that you can almost hear. This was different. This was the quiet of a room where something was present, where the air had weight to it, where stillness felt chosen rather than accidental. Light came in through the arched front window and the two narrow side windows. Warmer than it should have been given the morning outside. Not uncomfortable, just noticeable. The kind of warmth you feel when you step into a room where someone has just been. Except the warmth was everywhere and even. I walked down the center aisle. Old wooden pews, dark and smooth from use. No books. No programs, no signs of recent occupation, just the benches and the light and that warmth and that quiet. I walked toward the front, and I stopped. There was a man in the front pew. I don't know how I missed him when I came in. The church was not large. I had looked down that aisle when I entered. But somehow, he was simply there now, seated facing the simple wooden cross at the front of the room, and I was standing in the aisle behind him, trying to understand how I had not seen him. "Hello," I said. He turned, and I want to try to tell you what that felt like, but I already know I am going to fall short. It was not frightening. It was the complete opposite of frightening, but it was also not the comfort of ordinary things. It was bigger than that. The way standing at the edge of the ocean is bigger than you expect every time, even when you have stood there before. Something vast and calm and entirely beyond your ability to contain or categorize. He looked at me with no surprise, no question, like he had simply been here the whole time and my arrival was exactly what he had expected. He said, "I've been waiting." Every practical instinct I had said to ask who he was, how he got in, whether he was aware this was private property under active development review. Those were the right questions for a man in my position. I didn't ask any of them. I sat down in the pew behind him, not beside him, behind. I needed a small margin of space between us because without it, I genuinely wasn't sure I could hold myself together, and I did not understand why. Nothing alarming had happened. A man sat in a church and said he'd been waiting. That was all. But something in me, something below language and below logic, already knew what this was. Not knew in the way you know a fact, knew the way your body knows when something important is happening before your mind has caught up. A recognition that had no words yet, but was already completely certain of itself. He didn't speak right away. He let me sit. In that silence I became very aware of something I had not thought about in years. The Swiss developer, the dinner in Zurich, the notebook in my jacket pocket and the sentence I had written in it and carried like a compass for a decade. Build for the photograph. I had built so much, so many things that looked powerful from the outside. And sitting in that pew, in that warmth, in that particular quiet, I felt for the first time the full weight of what I had spent all those years constructing. Not the buildings, the version of myself that lived inside the philosophy, the man who evaluated everything by how it appeared from a distance. How exhausting that man was, how lonely. I hadn't let myself know it was lonely, because there was always a next project, always a next photograph, always another room full of people who were angling for attention, and among whom I could feel the satisfaction of being the one they were angling toward. But here, in this small stone building with the warm light and the quiet, there was no audience, there was no angle, there was just a man in a pew who had been waiting for me, and there was me. And there was nothing between us except the truth of what I actually was, underneath all the things I had built on top of myself. I said quietly, not planning to say it, "I built things so people would talk about them from far away." He nodded. "I know," he said. "I thought that was the same as mattering," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very gently, "What is it that you actually wanted to matter to?" The question hit me somewhere I wasn't guarded. I didn't answer right away. I sat with it. And the answer that came up was not the one I would have given in any professional context. It was smaller than that, more specific. I wanted to matter to the people in the same room. Not the people looking at the photograph from far away, the people actually present. The people who would remember not what I built, but how it felt to be near me while I was building it. I had spent a decade running from that want, because it felt small compared to legacy. Because I had been told by a man I admired over a dinner table in Zurich that the photograph was what survived. But the photograph doesn't feel anything. The photograph doesn't remember you. The photograph just sits there being looked at by people you will never meet. I said, "I think I've been building the wrong things." He said, "You've been building for the wrong reasons. The ability itself is not wrong." That distinction mattered to me more than I could explain in the moment. He was not telling me that everything I had done was worthless. He was telling me that the same hands, the same mind, the same drive could be pointed somewhere different, could build something that wasn't just photographed but lived in, breathed in, needed. We talked for what felt like a long time, about power and what it's actually for, about the difference between influence that protects people and influence that simply impresses them, about what it means to have resources in a world where so many people have none, and what the weight of that really is if you let yourself feel it honestly. He asked me what I was afraid of. I said I didn't think I was afraid of much. He smiled, not unkind. He said, "You're afraid that if you stop performing, there will be nothing underneath worth staying for." My throat closed. I looked at the old wooden cross at the front of the room. Simple, not decorated, not impressive in any photographic sense. "Yes," I said. "Then let me tell you what is underneath," he said. And he did. He spoke about me with a specificity that should have been impossible. He mentioned Zurich, the dinner, the notebook, the sentence I had written down and built a decade of my life inside of. He knew it. He knew what it had cost me to hold that philosophy as my center. He knew the shape of the loneliness I had not let myself acknowledge. Nobody knew those things. Faris knew I had been at that conference. He did not know about the notebook. He did not know about the sentence. I had never said it out loud to a single person. And yet, I looked at him, really looked at him, and I asked quietly who he was. He told me, and something in my chest responded before my mind had a chance to argue with it, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was there, like hearing a song you somehow already knew the melody to even though you were certain you had never heard it. I said, "I was not raised to believe in you." He said, "I know exactly how you were raised. I know every room you've sat in. I know every conversation that shaped you, including the one in Switzerland." I put my face in my hands. I stayed like that for a while. I could not have told you how long. Time was not moving the way it moves outside. It had a different quality in there, like it was expanding rather than passing, like each moment had more space inside it than moments usually do. When I looked up, he was still there. "What do I do now?" I said. He said, "You already know." And I did. I had probably known since the first bulldozer stalled. Some quiet part of me had been knowing for weeks, while the louder part of me kept pushing forward because stopping felt like losing, and I had never learned how to lose without it meaning something was wrong with me. But this didn't feel like losing. It felt like the first honest thing I had done in years. I stood up slowly. I looked at him. I said, "I'll come back." He smiled, and I walked out. The morning air outside landed on me like something physical, present, real. Bright in a way I was suddenly capable of noticing. Samir was leaning against the car with his phone in his hand. He looked up and went completely still. The look on my face had clearly done something to him that he wasn't prepared for. "How long was I in there?" I said. He looked at his watch. Looked at me, looked at his watch again. 4 minutes, he said. I turned and looked back at the church door. "That's not possible," I said. "Sir," he said carefully. "I timed it. You walked in, and I checked my watch because I wasn't sure how long to wait before knocking. You were inside for 4 minutes. I stood on that open ground, with the wind coming off the coast, and the smell of salt everywhere, and I understood that what had just happened to me could not be filed under any category I had previously used to organize my understanding of reality. 4 minutes. I had lived what felt like hours in there. And I had come out unable to locate the man I was when I went in. I didn't make any announcements that day. I drove back to the office and sat at my desk for a long time without touching anything on it. The renderings were pinned to the board on the wall, the timeline, the investor summary, the projected photographs of what Al Rauda was going to look like from above. I looked at all of it for a while. Then I called my legal team and told them the project was being redesigned. Silence on the phone. My lead attorney said, very carefully, "Is there a legal issue we should be aware of?" "No," I said. "It's a values issue." Another silence. "The church parcel is permanently withdrawn," I said. "We're finding a different footprint." I hung up and sat back in my chair and felt something I had not felt in professional context in longer than I could remember. Peace, not relief. Peace is different from relief. Relief is what you feel when a pressure lifts. Peace is what you feel when you realize you were the one creating the pressure. Samir and I spent the better part of the following week restructuring the entire concept. A different parcel further up the coast, no existing structures, no displacement required. The luxury development could still exist, scaled differently, pointed differently, no longer the statement I was making about myself, but something that could actually serve the region. The original residential area would be preserved, partially. The families who had already been relocated would be contacted and offered the choice to return. I had a community liaison on the project, a woman named Hessa. She had been advocating quietly for the original residents since the early days of the project, never aggressive, never theatrical, just consistently present and clear, in the way that some people are when they believe in something completely. I called her and told her what was changing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been praying about this land for a long time." I said, "I think it may have made a difference." She laughed, a full, real, surprised laugh. That sound stayed with me. The housing program did not come from strategy. It came from a night about 3 weeks after the church visit, when I was sitting alone in my office, after everyone else had gone home, and I had a financial projection open on my screen. Big numbers, good numbers, the kind of numbers I had spent my career chasing, and for the first time, they were just numbers. They didn't move anything in me. They sat there on the screen, doing nothing to my chest at all. What moved something in me was a document Hessa had sent me months earlier. A needs assessment, housing shortage data, displacement impact studies, the economic cost to low-income families of being removed from established community networks. The generational effect. The way a family that loses its neighborhood doesn't just lose an address, but loses the whole invisible infrastructure around that address. The neighbor who watches the kids, the corner store that extends credit, the grandmother 2 streets over, the school the children have attended for years. I had read that document when she first sent it, and I had filed it. I read it again that night, slowly, with everything that had happened to me in that church sitting inside my chest where the ambition used to be. I called Hessa the next morning and asked her to come in with her full team. We met for 6 hours. By the end of it, we had the framework for what would become the first housing initiative I had ever directly funded and personally overseen. Not through a charitable foundation at arm's length. Directly. My name on it. My involvement in the decisions. My presence at the community meetings where the actual families told us what they needed, not what we assumed they needed. That last part turned out to be the most important part. We thought we knew what to build. The families told us we were mostly wrong. They didn't need what looked good in a photograph. They needed what worked for how they actually lived. Courtyards, shared outdoor space, rooms sized for the way large families actually gather, storage that made sense for the kind of lives people in that community actually had. We built 42 units in the first phase, 80 more the following year. I was there for the opening of the first completed building. I stood in the back. I watched a grandmother move through a kitchen, her hand trailing along the counter like she was making sure it was real. I watched 2 boys sprint down a hallway, shoes loud on the floor, laughing. I watched a woman sit alone in a room that was going to be hers and simply breathe. I had built many things. I had never before stood in something I built and felt that. The faith part of this is the part I hold most carefully, not because I am ashamed of it, but because it is still new in the way that things are new when they are actually growing rather than just declared. It is alive and therefore it changes, and I do not want to describe it in language that is more settled than it actually is. I began reading, on my own, in private. I found an English Bible in a bookshop in London on an official trip, and I sat in my hotel room that night and read for 3 hours, not to analyze, not to argue with, just to listen, the way I had listened in the church. I read about a son who left and came back, and what stayed with me was not the son's decision to return. It was the father who saw him coming from far away and ran. Not waited, not assessed the situation, ran. I sat with that image for a long time. I thought about what it meant to be run toward, rather than waited upon. I thought about the man in the front pew who said he had been waiting. And I understood that the waiting was not impatient. It was not the waiting of someone with somewhere else to be. It was the waiting of someone who had all the time in the world and had chosen to spend it there, for me, before I even knew I was someone who needed to be waited for. The next trip to Geneva was official. Trade summit, long days of formal meetings and long dinners, and the particular exhaustion of performing competence in front of people who are also performing competence. One evening I left early, told my aide I had a call to make, and walked to a coffee shop near the old town where a small Bible study group met in the back room. I had found them through a contact who didn't know who I was. I wore plain clothes. I gave a different name. There were 12 people in the circle, expats mostly, different countries, different backgrounds. They talked about scripture and doubt and what faith feels like when it is more question than certainty. One man talked about the year his company failed and how the loss had removed the one thing he had believed was holding his identity together and what had been there underneath when it was gone. I didn't say much. When the man leading the group asked if anyone wanted prayer, I raised my hand. He prayed over me. Short. Simple, nothing dramatic. Just asking for clarity and peace over whatever I was carrying. I sat with my eyes closed in a back room in Geneva, a prince who was technically in this city to discuss trade policy, and I felt held in a way that had nothing to do with position or reputation or anything I had ever built or earned. I went back to that group the next time I was in Geneva, and the time after. Samir figured it out before I told him. He had known me for 9 years, long enough to know when something fundamental has shifted in a person, even when they haven't announced it. He waited a few months, and then one afternoon, driving back from a site visit, he just said it. What happened in that church? I told him everything. He drove, didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, I believe you. I asked him why. He said, because the man I've been working with for the last few months is not the same man who sent me to find replacement demo crews. That sentence landed somewhere real. Hessa knows in the way that people who pray seem to know things without being told. She has never asked me directly, but once, at the end of a very long day of community meetings, while she was gathering her things to leave, she said almost to herself, I'm glad you went into that church. I looked at her, she smiled and walked out, and I sat in that room alone for a few minutes, thinking about how long she had been praying for that land. Thinking about the GPS that failed, the bulldozers that stalled, the workers who quietly refused, all of it adding up to a door I walked through on a Thursday morning thinking I was going to end an argument. The argument I ended was the one I'd been having with myself for years. I went back to the church about 8 months later. I pushed the door open and walked in and stood in the aisle and looked at the front pew. Empty, but the light was the same. That specific warmth, that quality of air that felt intentional, like the room was still holding something even with no one visible in it. I sat in the second pew for a while. I thought about Zurich, about the notebook, about the sentence I had written down and made into a compass. Build for the photograph. I thought about what I had built since then and who had moved into it, and what it sounded like when 2 boys ran down a hallway in a building that would not have existed if I had stayed the man I was when I first acquired this land. I thought about what the developer in Zurich had said, and how completely right it had felt at the time, and how completely insufficient it feels now. The photograph doesn't remember you. The grandmother who runs her hand along her kitchen counter remembers you. The woman who sits in the quiet of a room that is finally hers remembers you. The community that stayed intact because someone with power decided to use it differently, that remembers you. That is legacy, not what you build, what you protect, who you become in the choosing. I am still learning. Still sitting in back rooms in cities I visit officially, listening to people talk about grace and doubt and what it means to keep going when faith feels more like a question than an answer. Still reading slowly, at night, when the house is quiet. Still trying to become, more each year, the man who ran toward, rather than the man who built to be approached. What I know is this. I walked into that church to win an argument. I walked out with no interest in winning anything, just in doing, finally, something real. And I have not wanted, for even a moment, to go back to who I was before I walked through that door. If my story did anything for you today, I hope it's this. The thing you've been building your life around might not be the thing worth building toward. Sometimes it takes hitting a wall you cannot move to find out what's actually on the other side of it. I'd love for you to subscribe if this story moved you. There are more of these coming, and I don't want you to miss them. There are 2 videos on your screen right now. Both of them are about people who were pushed to the edge of something and found more than they expected when they got there. Click on one and keep going. We'll see you in the next one.